Everyone. This will be our final session on Theodore Roosevelt. So I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of time to get your evaluation of not just of my lectures and the information that I've tried to convey to you, but what's your reaction to all it is, all of it. And that, I'm looking forward to a robust discussion once we get through the end. Well, when we left off last week, the election of 1912 had occurred, and Woodrow Wilson emerged as the new president, and Theodore had gained about 700,000 votes over William Howard Taft. And so maybe that gave him a sense of satisfaction that at least he came in second. And the real question would be now, what was he going to do? Would the Bull Moose Party continue? Would he try to lead the progressives or return to the Republican Party? Well, what he did do was he retired to his home and he began to write his autobiography. And then on the 9th of December, he traveled to Chicago to attend a Progressive Party conference. He urged at that conference making the effort to create a permanent party and compete with the Democrats and Republicans on an ongoing basis. Responding to this challenge, Woodrow Wilson's first legislative success was the reduction of the tariff, which had been a Democratic Party issue. And this was the first significant reduction since the 1860s. So Wilson starts out, basically taking away a bit of the thunder from the Democrats and from the potential progressives. Well, the party itself, the Progressive Party, was now pretty drained financially, and a lot of its leaders started to drift away. With every passing year, things got worse and worse, and the party came to be dominated by this individual, George Perkins, who was a businessman, rather wealthy, and he provided much of the funding to keep the party alive. But the problem for many progressives was that Perkins opposed enforcement of trust busting, and he embraced big business generally. Surprisingly, despite these obvious conflicts over principles and policies, Roosevelt continued to give support to Perkins, and that caused additional problems within the party itself. When Amos Pinchot lobbied for Perkins' resignation, Roosevelt responded angrily and threatened to leave the party if Perkins was forced from the party. He wrote a letter to Pinchot, and he said in the letter, "When I spoke of the Progressive Party as having a lunatic fringe, I specifically had you in mind." So after the election of 1914, however, only one progressive was returned to the U.S. House of Representatives. And so for all intents and purposes, the Progressive Party died on the vine. But this was 1914, and war had erupted on the European continent. Roosevelt privately expressed a view that the war had been inevitable, given the state of international relations. He argued for a strengthening of the nation's armed forces, and he fairly quickly condemned Germany as the aggressor and expressed support for Great Britain and the Allied powers. Those who disagreed with him, he dismissed as out of touch with reality, or he said they were Americans of German heritage. So you can start to see where this is going, not just with Roosevelt, but in the nation as a whole with respect to the U.S. drifting toward the entry into the war. Early in January of 1916, at a meeting of the National Defense League, he called for building the army up to 2 million men and a significant increase in the number of naval ships. And at the same time, he argued that the national government needed to support industrial expansion. He wrote that the most positive aspect of German culture was that the German government had, quote, taken care of her working classes while at the same time taking care of her business interests. And what was going to happen next? Well, The Progressive Party had a convention in 1916. Roosevelt did not attend. And the platform was pretty much the same as that of the Republican Party. Perkins tried to broker Roosevelt's nomination in both of the parties, but that failed. And the Republicans selected Charles Evans Hughes as their candidate, after which Roosevelt simply withdrew. And in the general election, Hughes narrowly lost to Woodrow Wilson. When the United States entered into the First World War, Roosevelt was eager to command a division in France. But he was denied this opportunity by the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, and by President Wilson. And Roosevelt's biographer, George Mallory, tells us that Roosevelt, quote, was as unfair as any man consumed with anger can be. And so he was now constantly attacking Wilson and his administration. And he would find reason to align with anyone who opposed Wilson. So he seems to have lost his political instincts here and his frustration with not being able to get involved in the war. He now believed that a Republican Congress and a Republican president were key to preserving the American system, protecting the nation from the rise of Bolshevism. He was encouraged when Republicans won a narrow majority in the Senate. And, we're going through this. And now I just wanted to add, it's the beginning of the experience that the nation is having with the beginnings of the flu epidemic. And so there's the war still going on. There's this beginnings of what would become a serious domestic crisis when the veterans from the war started coming back infected and spreading the flu virus throughout the population. Now, Roosevelt's health was also failing. He spent the month of February in the hospital, and in November, he returned to the hospital bed. His condition seemed to improve a bit, and he went home for a few days before Christmas. Then, with basically no warning, he suddenly died early in the morning of the 6th of January in 1919. So what was his legacy? Well, here's what I'll give you some stuff to think about, we can talk about. Among the many persons who came forward with a remembrance was the former Secretary of War and Secretary of State during Roosevelt's presidency, Elijah Root. And his remembrance was published in the December 1919 issue of the North American Review. The excerpts that follow strike me as coming from someone with whom Roosevelt shared most views about the nation's role in the global arena. And here's what Elijah Root had to say about it. He, Roosevelt, saw that in the marvelous development of human wealth and human power to produce wealth, we had gradually slipped away from the old, simple relations of equality among our people, that a crust was forming of power and privilege and superiority based on wealth, and a steadily, certainly growing discontent was making its way among the people of our country. And he undertook, though there was no crisis, to make one and to bring the people of America back to the supremacy of law for liberty. The millions who were beginning to feel that our free institutions were failing, he taught to understand that there was a remedy by law, and he forced a passage through the difficulties, doubts, and obstacles for law and for the application of the great principles of free government through law. Another opinion was obviously going to come, and a different opinion to a degree, from Lewis F. Post, the editor of The Public and a strong single taxer. And Post said after his death, Roosevelt was never a profound thinker in the political or any field. His ideas were the mediocre, commonplace stock of the ordinary man. He never analyzed or criticized them. He adopted the ordinary intellectual furniture of the average American, gave it at every turn the character of a moral issue, placed behind it the driving force of unwavering conviction, and then proceeded fearlessly to translate it into action. Everything he touched became instantly human and personal. You might want to react to what Post had to say there. The editor of the Single Tax Review added this about Theodore. At the beginning of his career, he was the close friend of Ernest Howard Crosby, and it was this chapter of his work for the reform of the civil service in association with the man who later became one of the high-minded leaders of the single tax movement that can now be recalled with a special honor to the memory of the ex-president. It's only fitting, however, that I give the last word to George Mowry, since I took so much of what I put in this lecture series about Roosevelt's life from his work. And he says this: Theodore Roosevelt had done much for the evolution of progressive politics in the United States. In the days of its infancy, he had lent the progressive movement the prestige of his great name. Without his support of varying intensity, many progressive proposals would not have been written into statutes between 1901 and 1909. Roosevelt's new nationalism and the progressive platform of 1912 were in themselves major steps in the development of progressive principles. And with that, I've reached the end of this series of lectures, and we now have plenty of time to reflect on what we've gone through and discussed. So I open up to comments or questions. You choose which. Start us off, Wayne, and then Marty.
A comment I would like to make is that if Roosevelt had been elected president in 1912, I think from what I know about history, I think the United States would have entered the First World War shortly after Lusitania was sunk. Have any reaction to that?
I suspect you're probably right. He had already reached his conclusion that the God was on the side of the Allies and not the Axis powers, and depending upon again whether or not he had sufficient majority in the Congress to get a declaration of war. Others may have a different thought about it. Feel free to comment. If not, I'll go to Marty to the next subject he wants to bring up.
Yeah, I guess I want to return to some of the talk last week about current politics, and it seems appropriate to lay some of the blame for Wilson's election on the like the Ross Perot factor or the Bull Moose factor, where he just entered a race and took a lot of votes from the other side. So, it's one of those things that, you listen to the reason why Cornel West and Robert Kennedy Jr. in the race, they're going to siphon votes from whoever. But, if that's your position, then it's really kind of hard to persuade somebody to not run. But and then my second comment had to do with reaction or action and reaction. When the tariffs are lowered, that was a way that the United States was raising a lot of revenue for the federal government. Did the income tax replace the money that was not coming in because the tariffs are lower?
Well, the income tax was brought in 1916. Now, my recollection is that it was only levied, this is the United States, it was only levied against fairly high incomes. And I don't know what the effective tax rates were. I know that it wasn't as complex as it has become in terms of what, income was saved from taxation by various deductions and exemptions and all that. But I don't know how much revenue the income tax started to bring in, if it matched any lower loss of revenue from the tariffs. There's probably, someone's certainly handled that research and published about it, but I don't know the answer.
Well, how about the fact that he ran as a third party, and it's almost like foregone what the outcome would be. Any comment on what you read that talked about that?
Well, only that, again, Roosevelt gambled that progressive Republicans would abandon the Republican Party and come to the Progressive Party. They did not. So even though he significantly got greater vote than William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson still got the majority. I mean, and that's all. We could go into a long discussion because this brings up the merits of doing away with the electoral college. You'd have to look at the states, which states voted for which candidate, and how did the electoral college votes compare with the popular vote. I mean, the great surprise of the Clinton Trump election is that we got a president who was elected with fewer popular votes than the opponent. Does that seem right to you? It seems this gets into a lot of issues with us, even the existence of the U.S. Senate. 2 senators from every state, regardless of whether or not one state, Wyoming, has the population equal to the city of Des Moines, Iowa. I mean, this is the kind of thing that we have. These I don't know what you call them, anomalies of our structure that were agreed upon in order to get the states to join the union, and then to create the basis for bringing in new states as they became territories and as people started to migrate to those territories in sufficient number to qualify to request statehood. And as one of the slides I read, Roosevelt's agenda as a progressive leader of the Progressive Party was figure out a way to amend the Constitution, make it easier to amend the Constitution. So, there are a lot of what ifs had he become president. There are a lot of what ifs.
That's all I had. Thanks.
Yeah, that's still a lot, Marty. Michael.
Well, I'd like to congratulate you and the Henry George School of Social Science in putting on this series. Really, I'm neutral as I live in England, and I've never been out of England very, very, not very far anyway. And I've been with growing enthusiasm, and I've been collecting number of books that you've been recommending or mentioning. So I've got a whole pile of reading to carry on if I can do. It's always something that always happens when I listen to you and lots of others. But I found I've got a healthy, or rather a different respect for American politics, or rather because I didn't know anything about Theodore Roosevelt, really. The only thing I knew was that Henry George beat him at one election, as it were, which is not very important, really, when you think about it in the great scheme of things. So I'm very impressed by this history lesson, and I think we should do more of that sort of thing. Look at the past in context at the time, and draw a chronological lessons from that. And I'm right up to date to what you said, Nat, today. Oh, one thing I was also very interested in the book, and which I've got, How the Other Half Lives.
Yeah.
And I've got a copy of that because it gives me an insight into the housing situation in America at that time, and it relates to what happens in England and everything else. So lots to carry on with researching. And I'd like to ask a question, really,
Yeah.
about American politics. Can you give me a bit? Well, I'd like to know what republicanism means and what democratics mean, and we've mentioned this progressive movement that as a sort of a almost a third party, really, and how politics nowadays is addressing the questions that we you know we dwell upon, really, the economic rent of land, etc., 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 etc. Go on and on and on. But
Well, Michael, the question you posed requires a whole nother set of lectures. But
I look forward to that, and I'll sign up.
let me and anyone else who wants to jump in and help me out here, please feel free to do that. But think about it this way: we began in the creation of this country, rebelling against British authority, and even though we rebelled against British authority, many of our leading leaders admired British structure of government.
Yeah.
And
Common
so,
law and all that nonsense.
pardon me?
Common law and all that nonsense. Well, I say that a bit casually, but you know, it's so easy to import, isn't it?
Well, our whole system of law at the time was based on English law. And so when they began to think about, well, what are we going to do if we win independence from Great Britain? How are we going to organize ourselves? Well, they thought about they wanted a certain degree of popular participation. And so he ended up with a lower house, the House of Representatives, somewhat equivalent to the House of Commons. And we didn't want hereditary power, so we couldn't call the upper house the House of Lords. We had to call it a Senate because we looked at the Greek and Roman models and thought that was a more appropriate model. But as I said earlier, we ran into this problem of not every colony that broke free from Britain wanted to join together and form a new country. They were, some of them were relatively satisfied being new sovereign nations on their own. And so in order to get those now free nation states to join the Union, compromises had to be made. And one of the great compromises was this idea that every state shall have 2 senators in the upper chamber of government. And then they were very skeptical of democracy, of allowing the people to have too much direct say on what went on, because they believed in a meritocracy, and they felt that only a certain segment of the population really qualified to know enough to participate in the governance. And so we ended up in the elections not having direct elections. And in fact, early on, the people did not elect the senators. That only occurred even at this period of time, and occurred I can't remember what the year was, but it was after Roosevelt, when the senators were previously elected by the state legislatures. And so we had indirect democracy, and then we had this thing called the Electoral College, where you as a citizen voted for an elector to go and vote for the president and the vice president. There are all sorts of other issues that they faced and tried to reconcile and had to make compromises with. And I'll finish my comment and I'll let Jim Frederickson jump in with this. At the Constitutional Convention, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, and there are extensive books on all of the debates that occurred at the Constitutional Convention. James Madison took extensive notes. In fact, just about 6 months ago, I finished reading one of the analyses analyses of Madison's role in the Constitutional Convention. At the end, Benjamin Franklin was reported to come out of the building at the end, and some woman came up to him and said, "Dr. Franklin, what do we have?" And he said, "Madam, we have a republic if we can keep it." And we've been struggling to keep it ever since, Michael.
Yeah, no, that would be a very good advert to do your next course, really, and explain all these things, because I think it's worthwhile researching in the way you do, because it's important. We've got to learn how the other half live, and stop all this bickering and fighting. And sovereignty among nations needs respect for every other nation around them, you know. So it's a big ask, but I know no one at the moment who's better qualified than your good self, anyway.
Well, that's quite a compliment. I'm sure there are plenty of other people who are up to the task.
I'm sure
better qualified to do that than I am. Jim.
May I ask Mr. Leroyd whether he has seen the musical 1776?
I've not seen that, no.
Okay, if you get a chance to see that, some of the issues that Ed raised are raised in a dramatic production, and I think it'll give you a little bit of insight into what happened at the time of the Declaration of Independence.
I did see a series on television when Adams was made president. It was a very good television series, etc. And so I did get a taste of what was going on at that time when he was trying to create an alternative to colonial rule, really. And
that's one of the best things that's been produced on television. The HBO series on John Adams. It was fantastic, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
But what Jim's talking about, I think, was actually produced in 1976 for the bicentennial year. If I'm not, am I correct about remembering that, Jim?
I think the musical was written before that. I don't remember the exact date at which they made on which they made the movie.
Yeah,
I saw it after a Broadway play.
Yeah, I saw it live back then. It may be available online somewhere. I don't remember, but the film may be up on the internet somewhere. Mm-hmm. But it's worth taking a look at, Michael.
Yeah, I've got a lot more to actually research, and it's almost beyond what life I've got left to accomplish, really.
There's another comment that I would add is that the comedy group called Beyond the Fringe did an observation on the American political party system. This is made back in the late 50s or early 60s. Yeah. And one member of the group is talking to the other, who he finds out is going to visit America. And he says, well, when you go to America, you realize that they have two political parties over there. They have the Republicans, which are the equivalent of our conservative party, and the Democrats, which are the equivalent of our conservative party.
Well, he got that wrong.
Right. But this was 40 or 50 years ago.
No, but Dudley Moore and Peter Cook were incredible.
It's worth adding this as a comment, and maybe some others would weigh in on whether they agree with me. But for a good part of the 20th century, particularly beginning with the Franklin Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression, there was a movement toward the center where, whether you were in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, the fringe factions of those parties tended to not have much power, and the centrist parts of those two parties came together to find a way to forge policies and enact new laws and move the country forward. And that continued until the mid-70s. And the problem in the mid-70s was that the U.S. economy was becoming strained and U.S. foreign policy had proven to be ineffective. And so we begin to see the splintering up of the parties and more ideologically based political activity, beginning with, well, I could say on the Democratic side, it began with the Jimmy Carter presidency in a certain respect. He's the one who began financial deregulation. The first money market mutual funds were created during the Carter years. And then with the election of Ronald Reagan, we had the introduction of what he called new federalism and an attempt to pull the federal government back from requiring states to do certain things that were unfunded. So one of his arguments was the states shouldn't be asked to do things without federal funding. And so if we're not going to fund them, then let the states decide whether or not they're going to do them. So I think we're still very much in that ideological debate over where power should be settled. Should it be settled in the individual states to a large degree, or in the federal government?
Ed, there's the principal reason I raised my hand was to ask the question: do you think that Roosevelt's opposition to Georgism grew out of the fact that he was a political opponent of George in the 1886 mayoral election?
No, I think he just, again, the last set of policies that he was going to propose as the candidate for the Bull Moose Party included a tax on land monopoly. Now, I haven't been able to find documentation on the specifics of what that proposal included, but here again, I think that initially he believed that the American system contained enough potential for equality of opportunity for anyone who had a will to work and save and invest and live a good, clean life, in a sense. Too much alcohol, too much other kinds of poorly chosen activities would bring you down, but he didn't think that any of those problems were systemic. I think by the time he becomes the candidate of the Progressive Bull Moose Party, he's beginning to realize, by his personal observation, by what he saw in the tenement house problems in the big cities, that there were systemic problems that had to be dealt with, and to what extent he eventually would have supported a change in taxation to achieve the outcomes that Henry George was hoping for. Who knows?
Right. I think that's a good point, but I think his realization of the truth of Georgism came later, or at least I get the impression that it came later in his life than 1886, at which time he was running for mayor.
Agreed. I mean, I would say much later.
Right. Thank you.
Walter, how are you this evening?
Contrarian as always. Thank you, Ed. The purpose of most of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention was not so much to prevent popular democracy or mob rule as it was to prevent political parties. And much of the Constitution was an elaborate mechanism set up to prevent political parties. It failed, and it failed because there was a particular moment at the end of the second Washington administration when Hamilton and Burr were each able to establish political parties very much in the English mold. And the differences of those parties were exacerbated by the Napoleonic Wars, We won't go into that in too much depth. But
Okay, let me interrupt you to ask you a question, because in terms of the timing, it raises, a lot of historians point to the battle that went on to get the states to ratify the Constitution, and that being the beginnings of the two parties between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But
that's not a partisan divide. Certainly not in the way we understand European parties. And the way that Americans understand European parties, particularly the British parliamentary parties, goes all the way back. It actually goes back to the English Civil War. Massachusetts, of course, being the most roundhead, fundamentalist, Puritan, knothead, religious Bible college colony, was very much in Cromwell's camp. Virginia, of course, were supporters of King Charles, to the point that the House of Burgesses in Virginia wrote to Parliament begging them not to execute the king and to send him to reign over us in his old dominion of Virginia. By the end of the 17th century, it had become clear to both sides, if you will, in the American divide, that political parties, particularly as they were understood in Britain and would come to be understood in France after the Revolution, were completely anathema to the American system. And I don't think hatred is too strong a word to describe how most Americans viewed European party politics and feared its effect on the American polity, the American consensus. This not only motivated a great deal of what went on at the Constitutional Convention, but then, of course, with the rise of Napoleon, you get the polarization between Adams and Jefferson. Despite having been an oratorical force against the British in the 1770s and 80s, by the 1790s, Adams was convinced that civilization depended on the British winning out against the Napoleonic French. And of course, we had the phony war, where without any declaration and without even making disclosures to Congress, Adams was waging war against the French at sea. With the election of 1800, power passes to Jefferson. Jefferson is, of course, very much in favor of the French and very much not in favor of the English, but he has enough sense to realize that Washington was right, that the one thing that will destroy America is getting embroiled in European squabbles. And of course, the War of 1812 comes about not because of Jefferson wanting it, or, Jefferson's successors, Madison and Monroe, wanting it, but because the British regarded the Louisiana Purchase as funding Napoleon's war against them. And that, combined with their impressing British-born American seamen to fight against Napoleon, made it pretty much inevitable that the United States was going to be dragged into another war with Britain.
Let me take you back and take others back to this creation of political parties in America. Okay, because as I recall, Jefferson in a letter, and I can't remember who he addressed it to. It could have been Madison, but I don't remember. In 1776, he said, "Now is the time for us to get this right, because if we don't get it right, we will devolve into factions." And that was his great fear expressed right there at that crucial point in history. And the question is, was it inevitable that we would devolve into factions? And we have different factions, and we now have evolved in our society forward in a way where there are various factions within factions. If you understand what I'm getting at, to be called a conservative, well, not all conservatives would agree that the current Speaker of the House in the United States is a conservative. And some libertarians, perhaps you yourself, Walter, would think that many of the people who declare themselves to be conservatives today are moving in the direction of becoming authoritarian. These are
Well, it comes down to how you define conservative. If we're talking about Edmund Burke conservatives, I have a particular problem with that, because Burke is personally responsible for the way most Americans feel about partisan parliamentary politics, particularly during the Whig ascendancy and the impeachment of Warren Hastings. Burke stands for everything that most Americans think is wrong about, let's call it British, because it's mostly British partisan politics. And it has only been wars that have been able to overcome the American aversion to not just European entanglements, but your entanglements in European partisan squabbles.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you there. I want to get some other folks involved in this conversation to see, we've covered a lot of territory in the last 10 minutes or so. What do others, what are you taking away from this discussion that we're having? What are your feelings about, the governance that we have and how we got here? And in particular, what role Theodore Roosevelt had in setting the stage for where we are today. Joe Polito.
Hi, more great information. I just wanted to chime in on what happened in the 70s. And I don't know if there's a connection to Theodore Roosevelt. But in the 60s, we had the Goldwater phenomenon, and what I would call an extreme libertarian mentality combined with a reaction to the federal government imposing civil rights. And Reagan became a fan. And of course, when he did get elected, he took a very libertarian approach to economics. And
well, that's a question. Did he? we could have a real debate, about the extent to which, Reagan was libertarian, or had he become basically in favor of a certain class privilege?
Well, he obviously cut taxes greatly. He deregulated greatly. He fought the unions greatly. Apparently, he enabled the growth of monopoly, nominated Bork with his wacky view of monopoly. And that, to me, that whole political philosophy has dominated the Republicans ever since, and simply got stronger and stronger. But again, I just wanted to go back to Goldwater and say I think that was a lever, a trigger And I don't know whether that goes back to, the pre Second World War world and further back into Roosevelt. But I just thought it needed mentioning about this libertarian strain. And of course, the plutocrats today, led by the Koch brothers and so forth, have greatly funded and propagandized that political philosophy and have obstructed the progress in the United States, which has taken place in many other countries. For example, universal health care. So their taxes are far lower in the United States relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, well, it would take us to a discussion of the correct whether or not the analysis of supply side economics is accurate or inaccurate, and what is the real supply side economic analysis? Is it the analysis provided by Arthur Laffer, which was translated by Kemp and brought into the Reagan leadership, or is supply side economics really another way of describing what the Henry George community would say needs to be done in terms of tax reform? All good issues to think about, Joe. Thanks. Marty.
Yeah, I was reflecting on the issue of the ability of the centrists during the let's say the late 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, where the fringe didn't have dominance. And I was thinking that it's probably due to the people, servicemen that fought in World War II, people that were born in the teens and the 20s. The reaction of somebody going off, on a crazy idea, you would get servicemen that won the war, so to speak, out in the streets saying, enough of this crap, we need X, Y, and Z. And as those people started getting older and dying away in the 70s and 80s, you got a crack into that centrist idea, and then anything was up for grabs, so to speak. So
Let me ask you a question. Do you think that was in large part a reaction to our involvement in the war in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I think that's a reflection where it started to crack. I really liked Walter's analysis of Biden being in a war and trying to have social benefits and having the coming of an LBJ moment.
Yeah.
Next spring. So yeah, I think that's I guess I was just looking at the analysis of if the political powers that be wanted to do something. I think they're always gauging on, well, who would revolt, or who would be, what would we do to counter, those Purple Heart guys, Anyway.
Yeah, I'll let that rest with the group for a few minutes. They can think about it while Jim comes back on a comment or question.
The question is for Mr. Perry, who mentioned Warren Hastings. Did he mean Warren Harding?
No, I meant Warren Hastings.
The impeachment of Warren Hastings?
Yes. Warren Hastings was the first Governor General of India.
Okay.
On a motion of the Whig Party led by Edmund Burke, he was impeached for his administration. The trial lasted 17 years in Parliament.
Okay.
He was eventually acquitted, but he was bankrupted by defending himself.
Got it. Thank you.
The
other comment that I would make is for Mr. Polito, is that Goldwater favored the Roe versus Wade decision. And that nowadays, people like to forget that. And nowadays, unless you agree with overthrowing Roe versus Wade, you're not really a Republican in the minds of an awful lot of Republicans.
Well, but we shouldn't be maligning Goldwater here. I mean,
I'm not
no, but
maligning.
a month before he went to Dallas, Jack Kennedy met with Barry Goldwater, and they agreed that they were likely to be the nominees of their parties in '64. And Kennedy promised Goldwater that he was going to dump Johnson from the ticket and put in Franklin Roosevelt Jr. as vice president. Roosevelt was at that point Secretary of the Navy. And he and Goldwater agreed that they were going to run a joint campaign, and they were going to travel around the country through all of 1964, letting the people see the extent to which they agreed rather than disagreed. In Kennedy's mind, Goldwater was more centrist than he himself. And had Kennedy not been murdered in Dallas, it's astonishing to think that whatever the outcome of the election of '64, there probably would have been a bipartisan cabinet, and there would have been bipartisan action in the Senate of a sort which simply was not possible in the hyper-partisan days with Lyndon Johnson as majority leader, which was the very thing that Kennedy was reacting to, the hyper-partisanship of the Senate, which kept him from enacting his program.
There are many what ifs in history, aren't there? And many people think that we would have never committed our troops to the war in Southeast Asia if Kennedy had lived and been reelected. I don't know if that would have been the case or not. Anyone else? Many of you have been pretty quiet. In fact, been quiet for most of this whole series of lectures. Love to hear from some folks who've been sitting in, listening in. What has been your reaction to the series of lectures, your reaction to Theodore Roosevelt as an individual, to his contributions to history? Anyone care to step out of the darkness and join us in conversation?
Ed, I do have a question in response to just what you said. I know he was also usually cited when we talk of the environmental movement in the US. So I wanted to know if there is anything beyond his work on national parks that is worth mentioning that you haven't.
Well, as he's early in his career, when he was in the governor's position in New York, he set aside land as state forests. Now, whether or not he had any position on clear-cut lumbering, or he was in favor of forest management and all those issues, I really don't know. I didn't really find anything in his writing that jumped out at me that declared him as someone who was knowledgeable about natural resource management so much. But again, he got a degree in biology as an undergraduate and had become what was quoted as a naturalist. So, but I don't know if he wrote any papers critical of how the resources of the states or the nation were being managed per se. Wayne, maybe you have something to tell us about that?
I'm not sure about specifically about that, but it is related.
Okay.
Particularly how he and William Howard Taft fell out, because he kind of handpicked him. Roosevelt kind of picked William Howard Taft to replace him, and Taft, I understand, had been appointed governor of the Philippines, and after he left the presidency, he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But specifically, Roosevelt thought they thought pretty much the same. But when Taft became president, he fired Gifford Pinchot, who is head of the Forest Service,
Right.
and that was one of the things that kind of ticked off Teddy Roosevelt, who was probably much more of a conservationist than Taft was, and maybe other bones of contention too. But they were going. He started out as political allies and one of his political enemies.
Yeah, that suggests that Theodore Roosevelt was willing to rely on experts and specialists to help guide his decisions about, how to best preserve the natural environment. Joe, you had your hand up, but I wasn't sure if it was still up from last time or you had another comment or question you wanted to enter.
No, I'm just very slow at getting it down.
Okay. We just have a couple more minutes. Marty, you want to take the floor for the last couple of minutes, unless I see another hand come up?
Yeah, I thought I'd go back to Lewis F. Post and just make a comment about what he had to say, because I think Lewis was probably the closest to Henry George, having been involved in the 1886 campaign and getting to probably the highest office of a Georgist to Assistant Secretary of Labor.
Labor, yeah.
So his comment was that Teddy Roosevelt wasn't that deep of a thinker, and I'm thinking that might be a trait for most politicians, is they assemble groups and powers, and it's kind of hard to be too far away from the levers of power and be effective. So people can say what they want during the campaign, but when it gets down to being elected, it's like just some of the old same stuff. So I thought that was a very insightful words that Lewis had, and I think it's probably an element of truth about all politicians.
Yeah, I don't know how fair it was. I keep thinking about the writing he did in his 4-volume work on the history of the West, and what Frederick Jackson Turner said about it, that it displayed an amazing ability to compile research from all sorts of sources, and he thought it was one of the best, written explanations of how the nation was settled, how the West was settled. So I put that quote in there from Louis F. Post. I thought it was probably a little bit more critical than it needed to be, but that was my opinion.
Yeah.
I've looked at a couple of things that he wrote or spoke around 1912, and he's talking about monopoly. He's talking about natural resources. There's an awful lot that's sounding rather Georgist.
Yeah.
And there, I was not able to get to Monday's session, so you may have covered this completely. But he wrote about what needs to be done in Alaska. He had some firm opinions about that sounded somewhat Georgist.
Well, the big thing to me was that last statement I made about what the Progressive Party platform contained: a specific anti-land monopoly tax.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have loved to see some detail of what that particular proposal contained and how he planned to have it implemented.
Yeah, the first bits of this Alaska thing. Alaska should be developed at once, but in the interest of the actual settler. In Alaska, the government has an opportunity of starting in what is almost a fresh field to work out the various problems by actual experiment. The government should at once construct, own, and operate the railways in Alaska, should keep the fee of all the coal fields and allow them to be operated by lessees on the condition in the lease that non-use shall operate as a forfeit. Telegraph lines should be operated as the railways are. Moreover, it would be well in Alaska to try a system of land taxation, which will, so far as possible, remove all the burdens from those who actually use the land, whether for building or agricultural purposes, operate against any man who holds the land for speculation or derives an income from it based not on his own exertions, but on the increase in value due to activities not his own. So and he says that there is a very real need that this nation shall seriously prepare itself for the task of remedying social injustice and meeting social problems by well-considered governmental effort. And the best preparation for such wise action is to test by actual experiment under favorable conditions the device which we have reason to believe will work well, but which is difficult to apply in old settled communities without preliminary experiment. So, if we had a few more of him around, and a few more Alaskas.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty strong statement that sounds very much like it was influenced by Henry George's thinking or by advisors who convinced him that these ideas were the right ideas. What year was that written again? Was that 1912, you said?
1912, the speech, Armageddon was in the speech name. So if you, confession of faith,
let me tell you that my work with the public, the issues of the public, I just got through year 1912, and I finished the year 1912 after I developed this lecture.
Okay.
So it may be that in the issues of the public in 1913, that Louis Post may comment on Roosevelt's conservation policies with some more positive comment, but it still kind of makes me wonder why he said what he said in remembrance of Roosevelt. That if he was aware of what you just read, that he might have been a bit kinder to Roosevelt in his remembrance comments.
Or maybe he just felt that Roosevelt was pandering.
Could be. There may be more an insight to come, and as I work through the next couple of years of the public, maybe I will be able to answer that question. Any final comment? Any final thought before we call it a night? Well, hearing none, Michael. Michael, you have the floor for the last hurrah.
Okay, I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that we have to take the issues forward, and is the two-party conflicts in America, it appears to me, and even in England, we're coming up for an election, and there's the Liberals, the third party have got the bit between their teeth that they might be able to make a difference. Whether the two-party, whether it is a bit like Ormuz and Ahriman, a conflict that cannot be resolved, because the issue we think is important is being, hit like a wall. You hit it to the wall, and I hit it back again, and it never takes place. And that's that I think that's a bit sad, really, because we need to come together. There's a theory in English in English House of Commons, is that the government are in government, but the opposition are the loyal opposition. So they should form a different role. They shouldn't be antagonizing. They're both in government, really, and they should be seeking a consensus that's best, and they should take off their partisanship when they enter the chamber. I don't know what it's like in America.
Well, it was to the extent the term liberalism in the United States applied to the centralist parts of the two diverse parties. That idea of liberalism was the basis for our public policy movement from, again, the late 30s up until the early 70s. That term no longer applies to the way, the views about what kind of, what should be the basis of our public policy. And I don't know what the answer, how we would describe it today, other than that there is this serious ideological divide. And so what I think is scary to many Americans, at least it's scary to me, is that when one party takes the majority in the House in Congress and the presidency from the other party, we can get a 180-degree change in what laws and policies are going to be advanced. Instead of incrementally trying to find consensus, we get a movement that people have a hard time adjusting to, both in foreign policy, economic policy, some of the social policy issues. I mean, as we've been discussing, the issue of abortion in the United States. And getting back to what I said last week, we cannot seem to agree on what our natural rights are. Do we have any natural rights, and what are they? And if there's no consensus that these are natural rights that must be protected by all, then where are we as a society? A lot to think about. I thank you all for joining us for this series of lectures. I hope you've learned something important and that it's given you a lot of food for thought. And I hope you'll join with the Henry George School for the next program that is coming up. And maybe Ibrahima wants to tell you about that now before we break.
Very much so. Thank you, Ed. And yeah, so we are done for the Theodore Roosevelt class, which I think we all enjoyed. But it is an upcoming course by Dan Sullivan on Henry George's concept of money and how it relates to the so-called Chicago Plan. There is another course on money that I'm working on with Alan Smith. That one is not talking about what our money system should be, but it will describe as it is today. So we would like to call it the mechanics of money creation. So I hope to see you soon, and we will have all those events posted on the website. I think Dan's class is already out, which is gonna start, I think, on the 16th of October. So we hope to see you soon. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks.